On behalf of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Center, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Culturally and Linguistic Responsive Care for Early Psychosis. I am Jessica Mora and I will be your moderator. I am a senior fellow in psychosis treatment and recovery in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington. My work has largely focused on cultural adaptations to evidence-based treatments in severe mental illness, and therefore I am particularly excited to have this forum to discuss such an important topic. The MHTTC network is a nationwide organization that is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration with the purpose of disseminating and implementing evidence-based practices for mental health disorders into the behavioral health workforce. The MHTTC network consists of a national coordinating office, 10 regional centers, a tribal affairs center, and a Hispanic and Latino center. Together, our collaborative network supports resource development and dissemination, training and technical assistance, and workforce development to the mental health field throughout the United States. The Northwest MHTTC is based at the University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. We provide training and technical assistance in evidence-based practices to behavioral health and primary care providers and school and social service staff whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes for individuals with or who are at risk of developing severe mental illness in Region 10, which includes Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And broadly, our goals at the Northwest MHTTC are to heighten awareness, knowledge, and skills of the workforce addressing the needs of individuals with mental illness, accelerate adoption and implementation of mental health-related EBPs across Region 10, and to foster alliances among culturally diverse mental health providers, policymakers, family members, and clients. On this note, it is our intention to always be mindful of using language that promotes recovery and culturally appropriate terminology. We encourage all clinicians to use and champion person-first language, which emphasizes the individual, not the condition or disability. Person-first language is a way to demonstrate respect for a person's dignity and worth. It is consistent with recovery-oriented practices and promotes treatment environments that foster respect, human dignity, and hope. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jorge Ramirez Garcia. Jorge is a research and evaluation scientist at the Oregon Research Institute and serves on the Cultural Competence and Continuing Education and the Health Equity Committees of the Oregon Health Authority. He serves on the editorial boards of a Cultural and Ethnic Minority Psychology and journal Latinx Psychology, and his professional activities have largely focused on service programming and research to strengthen family and community care of individuals with psychosis. As part of this work, Jorge has amassed an impressive body of research examining holistic frameworks of family and ethnocultural factors that affect individuals with psychosis. Today, Jorge is going to share his expertise on clinical and organizational best practices to promote culturally and linguistically responsive care. After his talk, we will have some time set aside for a brief Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming Jorge. Jorge, over to you.
Thank you, Jessica, for the introduction. And we're coming to you in this webinar on April the 8th. It's a beautiful spring morning in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, but we want to acknowledge the COVID-19 pandemic and all the people that are suffering because of it. Our hearts go out to the healthcare workforce and people who are on the front lines. We're here to carry on the work that we all have to during this crisis. I want to thank the Northwest Technical Transfer Center for the opportunity to share this body of work that is really the product of a lot of years of work, a lot of hard work of my colleagues and mentors, the funding from the National Institute of Mental Health and RSA training, Paso Norte Health Foundation funding, and the many, many hours of work of colleagues and mentors around the country. I am going to lead this webinar today by reminding us of the importance of psychosis and culturally and linguistically responsive care. It's important to ground ourselves in that, and that will lead us into the need specifically for this type of care for people and families affected by psychosis. This work is largely based on schizophrenia and on the work that we have done with samples of Latinx family caregiving, family caregivers. And, but it is, I think, relevant to many audiences. Thank you for being here. Then we are going to in parts 3 and 4 have some illustrations of culturally and linguistically responsive care and some implications to continue this work. Let's start with the importance of psychosis in cultural and linguistically responsive care. This is just a reminder that psychosis involves delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, impaired functioning, and that there is, of course, a heavy presence of dopamine excessive levels that are associated with the symptoms. It has a very heavy hereditary component, as we can see in the population at large in schizophrenia, the prevalence. The risk is about 1.5 if you have one parent with schizophrenia, about 15% approximately, and approximately around 50%, 50, if you have two parents with affected with this condition. The Diathesis-Stress hypothesis of schizophrenia is a way to remind us that despite that biological and heredity component, genetic component, much remains to be explained. As we can see, 50% of individuals, as an illustrative example, even when they have two parents, do not necessarily get afflicted with the onset of psychosis. And this leads us to the thinking, the major overarching thinking in the field that we need the combination of that biological vulnerability referred to as diathesis and stressful conditions in the environment to push people over the edge and have an onset of psychosis. This is very well illustrated and detailed by the work of Keith Nesterlein and his body of work and his colleagues at UCLA. And I just want to draw your attention to the top row right now, that that biological vulnerability you can see in the top row with dopamine dysfunctioning and so forth. In the bottom row, we have this notion of the stress. What are the stressful factors that impact onset and occurrence of psychosis, family and other stressful environments. And in the middle, we have, of course, personal and environmental protective factors, which are really deserve a lot more of our attention. And all these things interact. And on the very far right, our outcomes once we have psychosis, of course, is impaired social functioning and psychotic symptoms and occupational functioning. This all leads to the public health importance of psychosis because there is usually an early onset. Then we have people living with this condition for many years, many decades. And due to the impact in functioning, there is a great deal of disability. There is a high risk of concurrent physical healthcare illnesses, a high risk for diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, and also, of course, concurrent substance use addictions and depression and other disorders. It is very well documented that people with psychosis have a shorter lifespan than people on average, about 10 to 15 years of shortened life. Let's turn the attention now to culturally and linguistically responsive care. Let's define this, and I'm going to draw attention to the culturally and linguistically appropriate service standards as a framework for cultural and linguistically appropriate care in applied to psychosis, but in work in many, many arenas in health and behavioral health. So cultural and linguistically responsive care is defined as services that are respectful, responsive to individuals' cultural beliefs, preferred languages, communication, health literacy levels, and our goal that we're striving, and the reason why we're here today is to try to do this across all members of organizations and all points of contact with the people we serve. Why do we have culturally and linguistically responsive care? People refer to this as a couple of major points: a business case and the humanitarian or social justice case. And really, what it really amounts to is the goal is to improve the quality of care to every single individual that we can impact. It's a good way to summarize this. You can see the details here. And I also encourage you to use the cultural and linguistically appropriate service standards as a resource for those of you who need to do more of a detailed case in your areas of work. We have to define culture, and thanks to the supplement of the U.S. General Report on Mental Health, Cultural, Race, and Ethnicity in 2000, we are in a better position to remind ourselves, our colleagues, in the work we do, that culture, race, and ethnicity matters in all the fibers of mental health, whether it is psychiatric epidemiology, treatment, prevention, long-term recovery. So also encourage you to use this resource. Defining culture is a very tricky matter. My colleagues and I put together a special issue on culture and community psychology, and we found over 150 definitions of culture. It is a very important topic, but highly elusive also to define. I am going to once again run the class, the Cultural Linguistic Appropriate Service Standards definition that culture is an integrated pattern of thoughts, communication, actions, customs, beliefs, and values. And these are generally associated with groups of individuals, meaningful groups defined by racial, ethnic, religious, spiritual, linguistic, socioeconomic, or other such as geographic backgrounds. Briefly also, what we're trying to address here with cultural, linguistically responsive care is health disparities and inequities. And this is just a reminder that when we find differences in healthcare and health status, then we have to analyze, think through, what leads to that difference. And usually what we have is the case of many factors leading to that difference. But as the work here of Cook and others in the Harvard Cultural Mental Health Research Center remind us that there is discrimination, bias, stereotyping, and then opportunities in the healthcare system to provide cultural and responsive care. Health disparities and inequities are defined as a subset of differences by health status, healthcare utilization, or health determinants. Determinants are factors that lead to health. And we're basically focusing on avoidable differences, largely due to social determinants and ethnic cultural determinants of health. So let's turn our attention for specifically the need for cultural and linguistically appropriate care in psychosis. I do want to anchor this discussion with the fact that this is based a lot on the work of my colleagues and me, and working with families of Mexican American samples, Latinx samples. There is a lot of important work out there, and I'm just happy to share this work with you and continue learning from others in the field. And the reason why we're here as a statement of purpose, again, is that disparities and inequities exist. And when we can identify those factors that lead to those that are culturally and linguistically rooted, if you will, then there's the need for this cultural and linguistically responsive care. Cultural and linguistically factors or determinants of psychosis are those factors that have discernible differences between groups in their overall levels or in the way that they impact health or health factors. Thank you for thanks to the work of Jessica Maura, Weisman, Amy Weisman, and Mamani. They just recently documented disparities and inequities in psychosis and serious mental illness among Latinos and many and other ethnic minorities. This is just a very brief summary. I encourage you to look at this entire set of disparities that were documented here, but Latinx ethnic minority groups are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, poor outcomes in occupational social functioning, more likely to disengage from treatment, more likely to drop out prematurely from they are less likely to participate in case management, to engage in treatment, and to be rehospitalized. Let's turn attention to these cultural and linguistic determinants of psychosis. Now decades of well-documented clinical and research evidence on cultural idiomatic views of mental illness that differ from what I just presented in the beginning, which is biological rooted model based on brain dysfunctioning and vulnerabilities. Researchers and clinicians have documented that there is the view that in Latinx families, when they are approached about defining what is happening, that there are nervios, that their afflicted care member with psychosis is having a case of nervios. And this is a term that is used, generally speaking, to refer to all kinds of psychological distress. So family caregivers and people in the community, when they ascribe to this notion, then they might think, well, it's a case of distress, anxiety, therefore tranquilizers, tranquilizers, relaxation, or teas or remedies to calm and bring those levels of distress is what is called for. And as you can see, the divide in this picture, we're trying to illustrate that this issue of nerves is not so far off from our psychiatric Western model. Really, the psychosis, those dopamine dysfunctioning in the brain, you know, we know that the brain is tied to the nervous system and has implications in brain functioning, but it does impact the entire nervous system. So it is when we get into these cases of how people view the terms that they use to define them, that we can end up with misdiagnosis and treatment recommendations. There are other language and proverbs used by family caregivers of psychosis that have been identified in the literature. In case studies, a couple of them here on the top, locos, locos, pero no tragan fuego. This is a saying that, well, if people have mentally ill, how come we don't see them meet fire? And this gets to the how family caregivers are making attributions and wrestling with, on the one hand, these expressions of psychosis, but on the other hand, seeing stable functioning and trying to reconcile. Now there is a very well-documented set of body of literature on attributions, and how attributions of the person with psychosis attributions, whether this is under their control or not, end up having an impact on the caregiver behavior. In the 90s, Peter Warnash and colleagues documented the coping, the importance of coping in phrases like si Dios quiere. We'll see, God willing, we will have a resolution to, psychiatric crisis in interviews with Latinx families in the Northeast. And this gets to the notion of coping. How do people make sense in their daily lives of psychosis, the family caregivers who deal with this. And these types of sayings capture culture, but they also capture what is important in the aspects of caregiving in psychosis, as we can see in this summary by Coopers and colleagues, that they walk us through what the relationship, as you can see on the left-hand side, the relationship between the caregivers and the people afflicted with psychosis, how they appraise. That means just how they evaluate and interpret their behavior, whether it is attributed to their own, personality or to something they don't have control over. This leads to this cognitive and affective changes in the caregivers, meaning how they relate to the person, what they process affectively, how they feel about it. And this impacts the relationship with services, how caregivers approach the term service environment, and of course the behavior toward the person with mental illness. This is an important summary. And we have here some data to illustrate this cultural and linguistic factor aspects of that model by Coopers. And at the left-hand side, we examined post-discharge, what happened post-discharge of psychiatric rehospitalization in the Southwest, to try to examine what leads to the rehospitalization patterns in a community mental health center that serve a large portion of people with serious mental illness and psychosis. We found these ethnic differences that you can see in the bars, that in orange, the Hispanic families, people after discharge up to 70%, more than 2/3, approaching 3/4, return to live with a family member. But only 10% had a living alone arrangement. And the contrast was European American white families, that only 1/3, approaching 1/3, returned to live with a family member, but 40% had living alone arrangements. This pattern of involvement with the families, with the lives of persons afflicted with psychosis, has been documented in the East Coast, again by Peter Warnash and colleagues. It has been summarized by Lonnie Snowden and colleagues across different ethnicities. There's tendency to take care of people with chronic conditions at home. On the right hand, have the expressed emotion body of literature, concerns what are those cognitive and affective reactions that Coopers presented to us. And so we have the finding across the world that stressful interactions are prone, if you will, to psychiatric relapse, although it is, I think, better to state that when the levels of stressful interactions in the family are low, it is conducive to recovery. But in the case of this high expressed emotion, we also found in data that we pulled in the Southwest, in Los Angeles and El Paso, Texas, we found that this emotionally over-involved pattern of interaction was found at a higher rate, 40% among the Latinx families, in contrast, less than 10% in the European American families. The patterns of criticism and hostility also differ between the ethnic groups. And the summary point here is that one phase, if you will, one aspect of culturally and linguistically determinant of psychosis is the caregiving is an over-involved and burdened aspect. This means that caregivers are really stressed, but the way that they show the distress and the way that they attempt, caregivers, that is, to work with their people afflicted with psychosis differs across ethnic groups. In a sample of families, Mexican American and Latinx families from the Southwest and from Wisconsin, actually in this collaboration with Sandy Magaña, we found that the levels of psychological distress are really high. On this bar, we see that 40% of the Latino family caregivers met criteria for high risk for psychological distress. And when we compared on this scale of the depression scale, that has been very well validated in large samples of Latino families. In the general population, that's 15%, less than 1/5 in the general population, but 40%, certainly more than 1/3, approaching 1/2 of caregivers of persons with serious mental illness and psychosis are distressed. This level of depressive system, as we can see in this path model, this is a cross-sectional data, but it is a way to illustrate that the caregiver burden, the reported subjective burden by family caregivers is consistent with a way to interpret, to explain why we have these high levels of distress. We have psychiatric symptoms of psychosis that are partially explained to the caregiver burden. So I talked a lot about those stressful interactions manifested in over-involvement, but it is very important to start putting that we use, what are the factors that can prevent that. So what we have here is the beginning of explanations of hypotheses to seek how can we lower those stressful interactions. In some studies that we did, we found out that this notion of acceptance and detachment borrowed from couples interaction research was related to low levels of over-involvement. So when researchers, team of researchers coded acceptance, meaning that behaviorally, meaning that the patterns of interactions between the caregiver in video recorded interactions, the patterns of interactions between the caregiver and the person with psychosis, that they were able to be there and engage, but they also managed to pull off. I encourage you to look at that detachment construct, very important couples research. This is related to lower levels of over-involvement. We also have coded narrations, these lengthy interviews of how people narrate the patterns of caregiving. And we have coded for, coping patterns. We found that coping efficacy, this notion of caregivers describing that they are, what they're gonna do is gonna have an impact, that they feel content and that they can do what they can and not have high levels of expectations are related to low burden and lower involvement in Mexican-American family caregivers. So this provides us a clue as to how can we start attenuating stressful interactions. And very, very importantly, I want to turn attention to what are the preventers, what facilitates recovery. Family caregivers are not only characterized by, a bundle of stress. We have a long history of research and, clinical impressions going back to the schizophrenic mother that seems to only portray family caregivers as, supporting illness and symptoms, but we had missed a lot in not looking at the other aspects that are supportive and promote recovery. This is why we have this notion here that I present to you in terms of phase, the warm, supportive, and recovery-oriented caregiving patterns. And this is quite this is an attempt to summarize what can be supportive and what promotes recovery. We know that warm interactions in studies by Steve Lopez and colleagues has been shown to predict lower psychiatric relapse. Caregiver instrumental support, the interactions marked by, hands-on activities to assess people with, by the family caregivers to assess their loved ones with their daily tasks and routines and management of their medication. That has been shown to predict medication adherence and treatment usage. And behind that, we have studies, qualitative and cross-sectional, that lead us to believe that, to get to those supportive and warm interactions, we need support by the entire family of that key caregiver who interacts the most. Religious leader, when caregivers consult with religious leaders and the religious leaders support the medication and treatment appointments, then the caregiver in turn relates that, that matters to them. And again, coping efficacy. Once people feel like they start getting a sense of what they do when they cope, their limitations, they can only do so much, then they seem to provide warm interactions with their families, with their family members with psychosis. A lot more to uncover. I do want to state that a lot of this research, that it is based on psychiatric relapse measured through independent diagnosticians, and some of these positive caregiving factors like warm and instrumental support have been rated by independent team of researchers who they were blind to the psychiatric rating scales. So there has been a lot of work that has gone into this type of summary of what can impact recovery. So let's turn our attention, now that we have a little bit of an overview of what is cultural, what are the data tell us about this. Let's turn our attention up to cultural and linguistically responsive care for psychosis. We have to step back now and think about the Latinx population and start thinking about its heterogeneity. And the things that really stand out, of course, is limited English proficiency and maybe 1 out of 5, some reports, demo reports remind us that about 1 out of 5 of people of Latinx origin have limited English proficiency. Spanish, of course, being the most common one, but there are also people with native languages from Central America and from indigenous native backgrounds who are immigrants in the United States and do not have English proficiency. We have a subgroup of immigrants in first generation and a second and later generation. And this leads us to what does linguistic and culturally appropriate care mean? Well, when we start looking at that heterogeneity in the limited English proficient subgroup, we're gonna need interpretation and translation services, but in addition to cultural adaptation services. In the English-speaking subgroup, cultural adaptation can be a likely recourse to provide those services. The cube in the bottom is just a reminder of how, even though we can characterize people as low acculturated and high acculturated and start working through this, and that's a very important step. These factors in terms of language proficiency, participation in American culture, the degree to which Latinx families and individuals retain and practice not only Spanish, but their culture of origin, their values and identity, starts becoming a multidimensional aspect. This slide is also going to remind us about that. This is a summary of how we can start thinking about cultural and linguistically responsive care. First, we have to remind ourselves that we are talking about psychosis. So because, as we saw in the beginning of the presentation, we have cognitive challenges associated with psychosis in terms of disturbed patterns of thinking and limited attention and vulnerability to stress. This means that information presented to this population is best suited if it's simple and you know, comes in small bites. If we're working with family caregivers, there's high levels of distress. And you know, when we are under high levels of distress, we also have cognitive limitations. So that's the start here. We talked about the limited English proficiency. Then we're gonna need translation, interpretation, bilingual staff involved. And if there's English proficiency, then that's when we need to respond to behavioral linguistic acculturation, as it's termed in the field, basically, what are the patterns of interaction with norms and social networks of individuals in language that they express day to day, and then their values in social identities, cultural, ethnic, and social identities. Linguistically appropriate responsive care involves written translation, oral interpretations, or bilingual staff. And this all is overridden by a framework of quality, meaning that to be able to provide high translation and oral interpretation that is effective in services with this population, we have to have qualified, certified translations and oral interpretation. Once we move from the limited English proficiency, or in addition for this population, but also for others, we start in this realm of cultural responsiveness care and turn our attention more to culture in addition to language. This body of work on cultural and responsive care generally has two branches. These branches are focused on the frontline workers, meaning are we going to train workers so that they can provide this care regardless of what service they're providing? In terms of early psychosis, which we need to address here too, we have different levels of services that need to take place. So do we provide training to those teams that are providing coordinated specialty care and train them all on the skills? Or do we adapt interventions? So let's first talk about this approach of training people so that every interaction can be maximally optimized to be culturally responsive. And a way to summarize this is the tripartite model of cultural responsive care. In the bottom, the tripartite model, the first two parts is cultural awareness of oneself and the cultural awareness of quote unquote others, our fellow human beings. So it really starts with that cultural awareness of what are our notions and biases and the ones that we have toward others. We have very important developments in the field in terms of implicit bias training now that it has become aware and mainstreamed. That's that cultural awareness of myself and what are my implicit biases when I see and interact with others. But on the top, that type of cultural awareness has to really be translated to skills, since this is the most challenging aspect of training and of research on cultural responsiveness care, because skills are focused on the interaction between the healthcare providers and the people they are serving. It's not only on their own awareness, but it's how they relate. So we need to, this asks us to shift focus in terms of how people interact in that service, in those service contexts. It is a struggle to capture, scientifically, but also to train at a practical level people to get to this level of cultural proficient skills. Some of the models that try to capture this, a shift in cultural lenses model by Steve Lopez, is the notion that we really need to switch how we view the patient's or client's behavior. We need to view them as Latino, we need to view them as, based on their gender, but we also need to view their social context and the clinical picture. And this demands that we switch those lenses over and over again until we're able to be more effective. Stanley Su, another pioneer of this work, has referred to this as scientific mindedness, and this really what he's trying to get at is that scientists have hypotheses and then they gather as many data to see which explanation is best supported. So that investment in trying to understand and find clues as to what explanations of people's behavior really holds. It is the type of skill that we need to develop. So shifting cultural lenses has been a model by Steve Lopez has been applied to psychosis. And he has described this in terms of three stages. And we have to pay attention to those various cultural angles in the engagement and assessment phase. What that means is that when we are interacting at these early points of contact, we really need to pay attention to how people define the problem and what are their expectations. In terms of early psychosis, you can see that this is very important. And going back to the very well documented views of that people hold that do not necessarily align with a psychiatric symptom-based biological explanation. So this model is reminding us that we need to pay attention to people's definitions of the problem and also what they expect us. They might be counting more on their own social network and religious leaders. And what would they expect? Do they expect a medication? Do they expect advice? Do they expect help in finding other services? It's very important in the engagement phase. The theory is a way to say phase, the second phase moving, is how do they explain the person's functioning, how therapists work. We have to think about and engage in working with people with psychosis. Then what are their expectations of person's functioning, and how this is going to help? As you can see, this is moving into more intense aspects beyond the engagement. In the intervention phase, this is something that receives short attention in the literature because it's now focused on what are the expectations of the people we're working with in terms of how they're going to change, how they're going to have impact on changing the person with psychosis, or what needs to change. And if we get to the point of deciding what needs to change, what are the best ways to promote that change? This model reminds us that in terms of culturally appropriate care, as you can see, there's a lot of front loading, if you will. That first stage and second stage has to do with those very early stages of engagement before we even get to this issue of providing coordinated specialty care. And we have to really work very carefully in the engagement assessment phase and in defining how people explain things so we can be successful in our interventions. Of work focus and cultural responsiveness in the literature. Here are the cultural formulation interview. A lot of you are I expect, familiar with this. This interview, again, it's a way to, at the front end, define how people view the problem that we call a diagnosis. It impacts the skills because it teaches us how to probe for culture. It impacts the assessment and engagement phase. Peter Warnashek has developed a social and cultural assessment tool for Hispanic immigrants. This is published in the literature and it's in the public domain. And it asks us to think through these aspects that we have already been discussing: language proficiency, family structures, social supports, and so forth. As I mentioned before, the class, the Cultural and Linguistically Appropriate Standards from the Office of Minority Health, has a lot of useful tools, including a behavioral health training tool that really targets this tripartite model and includes some skills, some training on how to elicit, how people narrate their own problem that we already discussed the importance of that. Those are some examples. Let's turn our attention to the cultural responsiveness of programs. As we mentioned, we can impact the skills of the providers, but we can also try to examine programs. So what that means is, in terms of early psychosis, we have multifamily groups, we have vocational skills training, of course we have pharmacotherapy. What does the protocol, all those interventions and others look like, and do we need to think through the cultural responsiveness of those protocols, if you will? This is usually divided into two sub-branches, as you can see here in green and in the lower brown. People usually take an existing program and adapt it to a cultural group. When we engage in that type of work, we think usually in terms of surface structure here. To borrow from Resnikov's language, this means, do we change the way we do things? Do we change the flyers? Do we change the setting? We move it to the community. Do we change it from an office-based and desk to a group and sit in a circle? Do we eat and talk at the same time versus lecture in chairs and PowerPoint presentations as this one? Those are surface structure characteristics. Another level of adaptation is when we engage in changing the content, actually, in saying, well, this program really doesn't address this issue that we're hearing that our families and or people with psychosis bring up, that they're having a lot of challenges in this particular area, in the way that they deal with their emotions and the way that they are struggling to find transportation. We need to add a module, a different context. That's referred to as deep structure. We're adapting an existing program and changing how it is delivered, or changing its nature, its bones, and adding usually, or modifying the content of it, not just adding. Another approach is to develop a program from the beginning and make it culturally and linguistically appropriate, and start with culturally and linguistically appropriate elements and then build it from the ground up. Those are, of course, illustrations of approaches, and there are gray areas in between here, but they help us to think about what is our approach to cultural adaptations. Some examples that we have in psychosis are in the adaptation realm, again, leaning toward that end of the spectrum. Social skill training for Latinos at UCLA, the work by Alex Kopelowicz. Alex Kopelowicz and colleagues also have adapted a multifamily group program that is very well known and used nationally in their work with Mexican American families, and they've even developed a very specific module to improve medication adherence. So that is the approach of taking the existing program and then working through how do we adapt it for this population. More on the spectrum of culturally specific ground-up approaches, culturally informed family innovation, but Amy Wiseman, that has drawn a lot from spiritual and religious influences that we talked previously in the first part of this presentation. Thinking through how can we use those elements in building family interventions from the ground up. The Psychosis Health Literacy Program, like Clave or the Clue by Steve Lopez and colleagues, is a community outreach program. And that has started with the notion of how do we identify in the community those cases that do not necessarily, those individuals that haven't reached services, and reach out through community education campaigns so people can identify psychosis. What are some of the cultural targets that we can think through in adaptive interventions and new ones? Again, thanks to the work of Jessica and Amy Wiseman, they've identified some very good lead for us: family involvement, religious spiritual values. How do we go through community engagement? How do we think through that? And of course, there's always issues of stigma attached to serious mental illness and psychosis, and trust and confidence in the mental health system. I do want to take a pause here also and emphasize the La Clave as a way to shape cultural lenses. This program is a really assertive way of addressing the disparities in service utilization, but also in reducing the time it takes for Latinx individuals and families to reach care. We know that the shorter the duration of untreated psychosis, the better the long-term recovery and potency of recovery efforts of people with psychosis. So one of the challenges is that in the field, we've relied on doing research and interventions and cultural adaptations by people who are already engaged in the system. And we're trying to go out into the communities and identify them at earlier and earlier and earlier stages. So I encourage you to look into this program that attempts to increase the knowledge of psychosis, people identify the psychosis, that they figure out how to do help seeking, And also this notion of attributions that we saw, it is very critical in caregiving to start thinking about, you know, how do I attribute the behavior, what makes sense, and how I interpret the behavior of people with psychosis. Let's wrap up with some implications for practice and research. In early psychosis, we have an, you know, very complex array of factors that impact. This is a great reminder of the earlier work by Keith Nectarline that reminds us about all the facets that are involved, whether it is family aspects, whether it's demographic aspects, the coping, the knowledge, and then we get to issues of concurrent substances and so forth. So there is a lot of complexity in terms of the cultural, social, clinical background that impacts early psychosis in this case, but also psychosis in general. So the three avenues of recommendations that I want to offer here are, starting with the first one, is that we need more quality and rigor in our cultural and linguistically appropriate service standards. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we step back and think about the context here, we have a really taxed workforce. We have people doing a lot of important work, whether it's early psychosis teams that with members in those teams that work in different programs or that are trying to reach out to this hard to reach population. We have the issue that we need to deal with the complexity of culture. I spent a lot of time trying to unpack that. We have a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings that are very well meant to improve our cultural responsive care. But when they are, when they come at a high frequency and rate, and when they're seen in this context of all the administrative burden and resources, then that people are taxed and have limited capacity in absorbing these trainings. So one leading recommendation is that when we invest in the linguistically appropriate care, to avoid the extremes, if we take a light touch approach, then I think we run the risk of the value and impact is not really visible. It's not visible to the workforce. It's not really visible to the program managers. It's not really visible to the people receiving the care. And then we view it in a way of, oh, we really gotta get through that. On the other extreme is that, you know, we can't devote all we do to cultural and linguistically appropriate care. We have to think about just clinical competencies in general. The more rigor and quality we bring to this work and avoid the extremes, is going to, I think, lead us to a better place in terms of finding out what works best and in getting more and more stakeholder investment in this. The second recommendation is to integrate ethnic and social determinants of health in assessments, intervention, and research. This is a broad sweeping recommendation, but the reason why I'm bringing this up is because in the public health arena, we really live in a time in which social determinants of health really dominate, for good reason, the landscape of policies and thinking. And they are really broad, as you can see in the summary by Paula Brayman on social determinants of health. They remind us that we need to think about the living and working conditions and the economic and social structures and opportunities. So we have a lot of important attention by policymakers on addressing these broad sweeping issues in the environments and social structures and social settings to impact health, including psychosis. So the recommendation here will be, we're very familiar with social determinants of health. we need to remind ourselves that there are cultural and ethnic determinants of health. What I mean by that is that, going back to the second part of this presentation, that issues of language, of health literacy, of identity, the way that people attribute mental illness, the attributions they make about the way that they cope, is really varies across cultural backgrounds. And if we just focus on social and structures without attending to the cultural factor, we can miss opportunities to impact a wide range of people with different cultural backgrounds. And so the proposal here is to think that systemically as those cultural and ethnic factors impact individuals and how they impact those relationships. We spend most of this talk talking about relationships and close relationships. But we have issues in living arrangements, shortage of housing. We have issues in segregation and criminalization of ethnic minorities. We have lower levels of education among ethnic minorities and lower levels of health literacy, and more challenges in vocation and occupation in the population at large. But then again, let's step back and think about how cultural groups defined by their urban or rural setting vary along these dimensions. We have to really take stock and bring those cultural and ethnic determinants of health. The way that I think we can do this is by paying attention to those assessments at the beginning. As you can see, we have a lot of work now thinking through how do people of a specific ethnic backgrounds and the population at large, what do they bring to the table at the time of the assessment? And when we work with models such as the shifting cultural lenses model, let's always systematically think through how does a cultural background impact, including on top of the social and living settings, the recovery options, the recovery opportunities that we have. Our last recommendation stems from going back and really basically encouraging us on cultural and linguistically appropriate services as standards. And the work of dissemination implementation science is very critical in this area. I think that if we step back and look at these frameworks and try to integrate them, in an applied sense, what this means is that we have to think through our organizations, the teams we work with, the organizations we work with, and the organizations we create with to engage people in the community, and those, especially those who are the people experiences the inequities and disparities. This is just a call of action here. Both the cultural and linguistically appropriate standards ask us to think about the workforce, about the leadership, about the infrastructure of organizations, and reminding us that if we adapt a specific set of flyers or documents or one specific program, it is at high risk of not being sustainable unless we have the whole organizational support to upkeep those specific cultural adaptations and to grow more and more. In dissemination implementation science frameworks, they also tell us the same thing. One of the best predictors of any implementation and sustainability has to do with organizational leadership, is the leadership to support these practices and programs in any arena, in any innovation, then it is more likely to be maintained, sustained, and disseminated. And I encourage you to look at this paper by David Chambers and Norton, that plays cultural adaptations in this type of context. What do we need to adapt and to whom? This is the type of thinking that is going to lead us to look at what are the infrastructure interventions that are going to support this work, so that it's not a piecemeal and runs a risk of being abandoned. I am going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation.
All right, thank you, Jorge, for a very thorough and thought-provoking presentation on this critical topic. I'd like to spend a few minutes following up with some questions and additional food for thought based on your discussion today. So first, Jorge, I was wondering if you could speak more to any specific ways or ideas as to how to promote organizational leadership's commitment to providing culturally responsive care in some of these larger healthcare organizations.
Again, I encourage us, thank you for the question. I encourage us to look at the cultural linguistically appropriate service standards, and they are 16 standards. And 3 of them are geared toward governance and leadership. And they remind us that institutions go through a series of steps to do self-assessments, audits of where they stand in their, usually organizations do a lot. I mean, there's a lot of scenarios out there, but let's just say that as a midpoint, they are doing a lot. They have a program to outreach. They have some set of procedures to translate documents. They have resources in interpretation. It has come to their attention that they need to adapt a program. They might be trying that out in the process of implement. But again, the cultural and linguistic standards say each organization go through a process of auditing and assessing oneself and looking at all those processes, you know, the interpretation, the cultural adaptation, and what are the strengths of the organization, what are the gaps, and how are they going to garner the resources to do so. And a lot of this also has to do with knowing your community. Of course, we know our communities because we have people coming to us, but it is also good to do demographic surveillance assessments, population assessments, and to do so in a regular basis. So those types of activities, looking at the hiring of staff, can we support more multilingual staff, and wrestle with that issue of how are we going to get the resources to do that and maintain those positions, given the growing population needs and so forth. I hope that provides us some sense. It is a way to integrate the good work and show the good work that organizations are doing, and then take steps on how do we improve.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So it seems like maybe the first step would be to have this reflective assessment of the organizational structure and how it aligns with some of these recommendations, and then continuing that assessment over the course of time.
Correct. And there are a lot of tools on self-assessments, a growing number of tools on cultural responsiveness, readiness assessments. If you go to thinkculturalhealth.gov, you will find their organizational tools, not just trainings for therapists. So you don't need to start and reinvent the wheel. There are tools out there, and at this point, I would say a lot of them. And choose wisely and consult with colleagues and people who have been doing this to maximize your efforts.
Oh, thank you. That sounds like a great resource. And along the same lines, I was wondering, you mentioned that ideally these culturally and linguistically responsive care practices would be employed by all members of an organization. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on perhaps like simple but effective ways or practices that might be particularly relevant in providers working with youth with emerging psychosis.
So if I'm following, the question is, how do we start promoting that all interactions are culturally responsive? And to me, that's just the way I'm interpreting that right now. It's this process of change. So in those cultural linguistically appropriate standards, we go through this audit and assess system, but then we also within organizations, we're also asked to make a commitment and have a program in place that is going to support this, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And once organizations make that commitment to sustain that, then it becomes a matter of how is that going to be instituted. Is it going to take the place of monthly, trainings that are very practical and address, different people, different members of the organization, the front desk staff. How is the organization going to organize and disseminate that across all the members of the organization? Again, that there is the need to provide that infrastructure of the organization that is going to be able to know internally what those needs are and how to start taking steps to disseminate that more broadly. Hope that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. So really highlighting the importance of that organizational support and commitment to promoting some of these practices. The other question I had, Jorge, was you mentioned some very interesting literature examining sayings and language that's often used with Latinx families and the impact this language can have on patient and family functioning. What are your thoughts on ways to normalize psychosis in patients and families while also being culturally sensitive and validating of some of those beliefs and sayings and traditions?
Well, I think that is basically the work of cultural responsive care that we acknowledge. It starts with that awareness, whether you were familiar with it or not, and awareness that, that's common or not so common, but that's what families and people with psychosis adhere to. And that intervention in theory phase of the shifting cultural lenses model ask us to negotiate, if you will, and respect that, that's how they see it and those are the labels, and being respectful, and then at the same time saying, from our experience professionally, if we engage in vocational training and social skill setting, then everyone's going to be better off. And if we have constant communication with the psychiatric nurse, so it is that process of acknowledging that and being respectful of different belief systems. And at the same time saying, we have a sort of recovery-oriented options that, let's figure out the language that we can use so that we can demonstrate that while working together, that we're gonna try these things and see how for you. So it is that back and forth process across the stages of services.
Great, thank you. And my last question is focusing on the literature you were describing that links high levels of expressed emotion with poor patient and family outcomes over time. And one, at least from my understanding of this literature, oftentimes measures of expressed emotion, or EE, have been developed and rated and scored using kind of Western measures of kind of what might be normative within family structures. And so I was wondering if you thought or had any thoughts on, I would imagine that, for example, in some Latinx families where perhaps family cohesion is more prevalent or more normative, we might also be rating that as high emotional over-involvement. And so I wonder if we might see differences in outcomes across cultural groups when looking at these very specific ways to evaluate or score expressed emotion. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how we're looking at this construct of expressed emotion across cultures, and whether we might want to better conceptualize some of these ideas when we're thinking in this more culturally inclusive way.
That is an excellent topic. The origin of the expressed emotion construct was in Great Britain in the 1960s, and it's very extensive field work. And one can argue that there is a tone of cultural norms from Great Britain as to what is the level of warmth and involvement that might be normative for that cultural group, for people from Great Britain or that Western. So I acknowledge everyone, I think, in this field who engages in this work acknowledges that it is a culturally laden construct. Well, most constructs are, and this is not an exception. The challenge that we have, let me address this as in a kind of research scientific way first, and then clinical implications second. So the challenge that we have in seeing this body of work and what it means to people across many different cultural groups worldwide is that if we change the construct, then we cannot compare it. So if we have a currency of British pounds and then we change the construct to US dollars, or then how can we go back and compare? Well, then you have to translate, and then so that makes it difficult to understand what is a value or a set of interaction patterns in one cultural group versus the other. So the approach that a lot of us have taken is to try to stay within the same original construct so we can measure it across different cultures. And the studies have shown that in quote unquote developing countries, the levels of criticisms are lower than in Western cultural groups. And then we can say, okay, we stick with that same gauge, with that same metric, that's what we see. But that doesn't really prevent us from also developing our own cultural constructs of what is normative. And as you can see in the body of research, people are doing that in developing, paying attention to other. So I encourage us to be able to provide continuity to this body of work, to do both, to retain that and know that it is culturally laden, but also pursue other ways of measuring family interactions. I would like to add and say that when I was training rating this, I was a terrible rater for over-involvement. I was driving myself and my team nuts. And I am a family member with a person with schizophrenia. I had a brother with schizophrenia, and I had a visceral reaction to it, that it was hacking with over-involvement. I was a product and a victim of my own culture. This is not over-involvement. This is just a family caring and looking out for this person who needs to be cared for. And the way that I brought myself to rate people like in my team and in my ratings, involvement, not over-involvement. That's the way I talked myself into it. Well, it is just very high levels of involvement. It is not over-involvement. Once I took out the emotion of over-involvement, then I was able to rate like others were rating and bring our readability ratings too. So I am a product of my own culture, like OR. In terms of clinical practice, I think that we have to avoid this issue of stereotyping families as over-involved and enmeshed, right? And seeing pathological family structures, look at all this enmeshment and over-involvement. I think we're better when we think about the stressful reactions to a very, very complex problem. And especially for early psychosis, the family doesn't know, compared to people who have been dealing this for 20 years, they do not know what this is and what's in store. And, you know, so there is higher levels of distress and that type of reaction at its high levels because it is something new. So we have to really avoid stereotyping families as being a bag of stress and over-involved, pathological. We need to think about that this is normative, that this is what we expect, that there are people who care for their loved ones, and that we need to start that process of the psychoeducation, of working with them and seeing what's going to work with them, in supporting their warmth, instrumental supportive factors, and in bringing support to them. As you can see, some of the literature is beginning to tell us that when the entire family system and when there's community supports for that one single caregiver, they do better. We need to also see them as people who can benefit from that relief, from respite in that daily interaction, stressful interactions. Those are my reactions to your question. Hope that makes sense.
Yes, beautifully stated. Thank you so much, Jorge, again, for taking the time to share your expertise today and to address some of these follow-up questions. Again, this is such an important topic, and I'm really excited that we're able to share some of this information and also some of the resources that you described to everybody that's watching. So thank you again.
I would like to add in closing, can be reached at J. Ramirez, my last name in one word, at ori.org, O-R-G, and that we're going to have references and tools attached to this presentation, so people can start working through the resources or get acquainted with new ones. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Before we wrap up, we'd also like to let you know about additional training opportunities. The final installment in our Behavioral Health Crisis Response Systems live webinar series, Implementing New Crisis Services, The View from the Ground Up, with Dr. Michael Flom, will occur on April 15th at 10:30. And we are hosting another free webinar with the Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon, titled Peer Delivery Services, A Broad Exploration, on May 13th at 1 o'clock. And I'll take a moment to provide you with our contact information where you can find out more about and register for these, as well as additional resources and training opportunities. So please visit us online and sign up for our newsletter at www.mhttcnetwork.org/Northwest. Also, we're officially on social media. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Northwest MHTTC. And if you'd like to get in touch with our center, you may also email us at northwest@mhttcnetwork.org. And I'd like to once again thank our content expert, Dr. Jorge Ramirez Garcia. Thank you to everyone viewing this webinar for taking the time to learn more about this important topic.